Welcome back, viewers. Just before the break, Junaid, Dr. Imran Ali had mentioned certain elements within this whole issue of globalization. We touched upon the necessity of looking at the world environment and the impact of globalization. This activity, there's an enormous amount of activity that is going around. I mean, even look at just the transportation of food. 1 pound of food travels about 1,200 miles around the globe, which may not be necessary. How important is it that a businessman in Washington must have his kiwi fruit from New Zealand every morning? So, there are a lot of these things. I mean, great, it's good to have the kiwi fruit in the morning, but how important is it? Is it coming at a cost of other communities? Is it having an environmental cost? Is it having a cultural cost? And especially its cost on identities of people. Would you like to say a few things about that?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, the battle for Seattle, as it was called in 1999, the resistance to the type of framework, international economic framework that the World Trade Organization was setting up, one of the principal forces of resistance was the environmental movement, the environmental movement globally, because they feared that the standards for multinational corporations was way too low in terms of their ability to violate and pollute, in terms of the environmental standards. And so this, and we of course now had a huge conference on climate change and all of them, the health of the ecosystem, whatever indicators you look at, it's in pretty bad shape. So I think globally there is an environmental movement that is saying this question of sustainability, the sustainability of the type of practices we modern human beings are engaging in, and particularly the transnational corporations, our militaries, so on and so forth, it's simply not sustainable. And so this has really become an important question, and I think it also raises other issues and questions about our willingness to respond. As Muslims, as the Muslim world, I often say how quickly and how openly we're responding to issues such as what happened on 9/11, and we're supposed to confront these new issues of terrorism, so on and so forth. An important question like the environment, on which sort of our whole existence is in being, is in question. To questions such as those and issues such as those, we often don't have a response. I think it raises a whole host of other issues concerning sort of what type of modernity are we living in, what type of modernity do we want, and what are the costs of that modernity. And this is where a lot of new social movements and critical intellectuals from the global south, in the so-called third world, and in the north as well, are raising questions concerning this type of modernization, concerning this type of globalization, and proposing alternatives, an alternative globalization in which the so-called sacred cows of modernity, be it the market, the nation state, the transnational corporation, all of these are being put into question and interrogated, and then new ideas are being put forward on what would real, serious, sustainable and just alternatives look like.
Now this is very significant, and also in the realm of culture, Dr. Imran Ali, there's a lot of activity that goes on due to this phenomenon that we call globalization, that has the ability to transform cultures. And it's like I said earlier, that it's not the Swedes who are wearing the turban and the tahmad. It is the Bangladeshis who are wearing jeans and what have you. And so it is us who are speaking that language of the modern industrial states, the former colonial masters, and not the other way around. And so there's a certain this inbuilt colonial element is still continues or rides the tide of what we call globalization. What are your thoughts about this?
I guess you could look at it that way, but I wouldn't be too worried about it, because I think the real issue is modernization, and that might equate to some extent with westernization, but I think modernization is the central issue that's facing a lot of countries, especially Muslim countries, and they have to tackle that head on. And if there are problems with the activities of multinationals and ethical issues, etc., I think they're much smaller in importance than the problems of our own atavism and backwardness, our embedded cultures, and the people who manipulate our backwardness for their vested interests, and they certainly exist in our own countries, but could also exist in the north.
Right.
And it's an unholy alliance.
Yeah,
so if you look at Japan, 1868 Meiji Restoration, a sudden decision by the Japanese ruling elites, in fact, to rapidly modernize or westernize or whatever you want to call it, but to start to change themselves and metamorphose into something that looks like
along modern Western lines.
Western lines.
But
And that
their
their salvation came from that, because had they remained committed to their medieval culture, they would have been taken over by colonialism for too long. So I think our issue is to really look at our biggest Frankenstein, our behemoth, which is our own failed culture, which is a culture of pre-industrial societies, of highly traditional societies, where a lot of this can be filtered out without much, without losing anything. And I think the problem that maybe this has been instilled from outside, or again by vested interests within these countries, in Islamic countries, the problem really is they're just too obsessed with the past and with their past inherited, embedded, atavistic type of norms and culture.
Now, if we try to argue the opposite, for example, let's say that if the world itself, in the face of the impending environmental catastrophe, must transform, then we imagine that it will be resuscitating communities and doing away with some of the bad effects of the mass society as it has come. Don't you think that the same thing that you point as a baggage, the traditional element that the Muslim world still has very much intact in it, don't you think that those teachings of parsimony and frugality that comes from their tradition will come in handy at that time?
No, absolutely, because if there's anything that's good in the culture, that will survive. If there was something good in Japanese and Korean culture, that survived. They kept it. But they didn't keep the entire culture lock, stock and barrel, which had already failed in our case 300 years back. And that is the whole problem of our backward-looking elites, our retrogressive establishment, and the completely opposite signaling towards backwardness and progress that we are engaging in. Towards our own people. It's a sort of a crime, just like the economic crime of expropriation and of inequality.
Now, I'm glad that you mentioned the Japanese example, because it's a very, very interesting case in point, because many people, many entities in the Muslim world, let's say, or in third world in general, would like to be like the Japanese, even though they were not the producers of modernity, but consumers of modernity. But somehow they became the producers of modernity. And fairly early. And I think that you mentioned Meiji Restoration, so it perhaps goes back to the Tokugawa period. And the process of historical reform begins from there. But what they did not lose, even in the Meiji Restoration, is their language. And culture to a significant extent lives inside the language. I think this is where we have lost out.
That's right. I mean, we've got all the bad parts without a lot of the new good parts, because we're somehow obsessed about keeping the entire past on our shoulders, with the result we can't even stand up and walk, whereas we need to run. And that is, I think, where the entire signaling system from the elites has been extremely atavistic, unfortunately. And religion plays a large role in that as well.
I want to discuss the globalization of religion as well, and see exactly that may seem as poison, could it be also the medicine? And so, but there's a time for a short break, and we'll begin with you when I come back, Junaid, just after a short break.